Welcome back to The Urban Organism. I'm Dr. George Wilkinson. Today I'm going to be answering the question, what are institutional economics? And I'm going to show a few images that help to illustrate what institutional economics are. If you're at all familiar with economic theory or economics in general, you'd be familiar with the idea of free market economics. And that's this idea that relative to urbanization, cities appear wherever economic opportunity exists. And that's sort of randomly dispersed around the world. And generally, if there's the opportunity, then businesses will appear, industry will appear, and it is developed. Institutionalists accept this idea, and I've really glossed over economic theory, by the way. I'm just trying to give it to you quickly. But institutionalists don't necessarily disagree with that. They have one caveat, though. Their view is that economic opportunity is sculpted, or the capitalization of opportunity is sculpted by institutions. So the rules of the game will dictate how one country manages and capitalizes upon, develops one economic opportunity, and it might be different from how another country develops this upon the same opportunities. And I think institutional economics are best explained or conveyed visually, that it's very easy to observe with certain instances. So I'm going to put up a few photos behind me and talk you through some examples. All right, so we will start with Detroit. Detroit, Michigan is actually a really good example of, oh, sorry, I put up Buffalo. We can do Buffalo first. So Buffalo is also another good example of a city that is segmented by a national boundary. So Buffalo is adjacent to Ontario, Canada, and this white line you're seeing run through this photo is the US-Canada border. Now, downtown Buffalo is right about bam, right there. And what you'll notice is the way that this urban sprawl fans around the center of the city is very lopsided. So on the New York State side, which is here, you're seeing the sprawl fan well into the interior. But on the Ontario side, it actually sort of stops right here where my hand is. So very lopsided development. You could argue, and I would, that there's the same economic opportunity in this location, but two countries are managing it very differently to states or provinces as well. And you might say, well, of course, they're two different countries. Well, that's the thrust of institutional economics. There's another example, and I mentioned at the start of this, which is Detroit. So I'll put Detroit up now. And Detroit's another very similar example, almost the same exact phenomenon. And interestingly enough, and I'll deal with this in another video, adjacent to the same Canadian province, Ontario, this on another side of it. A little counterintuitive, Detroit and Michigan are above Ontario at this point in where they sit in the world. It just so happens that Detroit is actually north of Canada, which is a very rare thing, but it is the case. And again, you're seeing Detroit sprawl very far out. Detroit is in a massive urban sprawl, quite impressive in its size. But then the Michigan extent is sort of just here. So you almost could argue it's stunted, it's lopsided along this national boundary. So this is the US-Canada border. So again, we're seeing this asymmetry in what is arguably one urban sprawl, one economic opportunity, and yet two different opportunities, two different ways of dealing with it, managing it. Another example I will share is this one from the southern border with Mexico. Here we're in Texas, and what you're seeing on the top is El Paso, Texas, and then on the bottom half is Ciudad Juarez in northern Mexico. And you can see also how urban planning is very different across the two countries. There might be the lack thereof, more informal settlements in Ciudad Juarez. That's why it looks more blurry. That's just a really mass of informal settlements and streets. And then you see more of that grid, that very perpendicular north-south, east-west grid, which is characteristic of a lot of American cities. So again, in this case with institutional economics, you'd argue, okay, there's obviously a difference in how these two countries are managing a similar opportunity. And the last image I'm going to show is from Asia. This is probably one of the most famous and visible photos of institutional economics. If you ever had to put it down to one slide, I would recommend using the Korean Peninsula. So you have North Korea here and South Korea here. It's an excellent example of institutional economics visually. So North Korea is a dictatorship. Capitalism is sort of not allowed there. There's not a lot of development happening, arguably very well preserved forests. Meanwhile, South Korea has free market economics, so they are occurring, if that's the way to speak of it, but there's development occurring all over, and the border is clearly a marker. And even that's China on the other side here. You can see China's also got a lot of sprawl and economic opportunity happening throughout, and yet you hit this sort of pitch black patch with North Korea. So there's institutional economics in a few images. Um, I think that helps to convey sort of the thrust of what institutionalists are about. And if you come from that base of understanding that, all right, the rules of the game can literally sculpt how cities develop, where they develop, the extent of their development, you can learn a lot about a city. You could zoom in on a satellite picture of a city at night and potentially know quite a lot about it, particularly when there's borders involved, which I've used here. But in future videos, I'm going to dive into some of the cities and talk about case studies. I think we'll probably do Detroit next. That's a really interesting case study. But for now, that's institutional economics in a few minutes. Thanks.